The letter arrived at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology on a frost-bitten morning in January 1897, written in the shaking hand of a mill foreman who apologized 3 times for his poor penmanship before getting to the point. He described a colored cleaning woman's daughter, approximately 13 years old, who had been discovered late one night in the Institute's engineering laboratory, standing before a blackboard covered in equations that the faculty had left unsolved for 3 weeks. The girl had completed the proof. Not copied it from somewhere, not stumbled upon the answer by accident, but had worked through 17 steps of advanced calculus and theoretical mechanics that graduate students couldn't solve, using methods that didn't exist in any textbook. The foreman, a practical man named Thomas Hendricks, had found her there at 2 a.m. during his security rounds, chalk dust on her dark fingers, tears streaming down her face. When he demanded to know what she was doing, she'd whispered, "I'm sorry, sir. I'm so sorry. I just needed to fix it. The mathematics was wrong, and it was hurting my head to look at it broken like that." Professor Harrison Webb, head of MIT's Department of Applied Mathematics, had received hundreds of letters in his 30-year career claiming miraculous discoveries or impossible achievements. He burned most of them without reading past the first paragraph. But something about this particular letter, perhaps the foreman's obvious discomfort with his own claims, perhaps the specific details of the equations involved, made Webb pause. He knew those equations. His doctoral students had been wrestling with them for weeks, attempting to prove a theoretical framework for calculating tensile stress in suspension bridge cables under variable wind conditions. The mathematics required understanding of differential calculus, physics, materials science, and engineering principles that took years of university education to grasp. The idea that a colored child, presumably illiterate, daughter of a cleaning woman, could solve what his best students couldn't was absurd on its face. And yet, Thomas Hendricks had copied the girl's work from the blackboard before erasing it, following procedure to clear the board each night. The solution was included with his letter, written out in Hendricks' careful block letters. Webb checked it that afternoon, then checked it again that evening, then brought it to 2 colleagues the following morning. The proof was correct. Not just correct, but elegant. It used an approach that none of the faculty had considered, a way of visualizing the problem that somehow simplified what they'd been overcomplicating. Whoever had written this understood mathematics at a level that exceeded mere computation. This was genuine mathematical intuition, the kind that couldn't be taught, only discovered in those rare minds that could see the invisible architecture of numbers and forces. Professor Webb departed for Boston's South End the following week, bringing with him a notebook, a pencil, and a deep skepticism that was already beginning to crack. Before we continue with what happened when Webb found Lydia Johnson and her mother in their boarding house room, I want to ask you something. If you're fascinated by the buried stories of brilliance that challenged everything we thought we knew about who deserves to be called genius, subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling me what historical mystery you'd like us to explore next. I'm building something special here, a community that refuses to let these voices stay silent. Now, let me tell you what Professor Webb discovered in that freezing boarding house, and why it would ultimately destroy everything he believed about the human mind. The South End in 1897 was where Boston kept the people it needed but didn't want to see. Irish immigrants crowded into tenements alongside freed slaves and their children, all of them working the jobs that kept the city functioning while living in conditions that kept them invisible. The boarding house, where Lydia Johnson lived with her mother, Clara, stood on a narrow street that never saw direct sunlight, 4 stories of water-stained brick and broken shutters, the smell of coal smoke and boiled cabbage hanging in the stairwells like a permanent fog. Webb climbed to the 3rd floor, his expensive coat drawing suspicious stares from residents who recognized the uniform of someone from a different world. He found the room number that Hendricks had provided and knocked, feeling acutely aware of how inappropriate this visit was. A white professor, unmarried, calling on a colored woman and her child in a boarding house. If word reached the Institute's Board of Trustees, there would be questions. But curiosity had overwhelmed propriety, that dangerous itch that drives men of science to peer into places they've been told not to look. The woman who opened the door was perhaps 35, her face worn in the way that comes from years of physical labor and worry that never stops. She wore a plain grey dress, patched carefully at the elbows, her hair wrapped in a faded blue cloth. When she saw Webb, something like fear flickered across her features before she controlled it, replacing it with the careful neutrality that colored people had learned to show white authority. "Ma'am, I'm Professor Harrison Webb from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I'm looking for Mrs. Clara Johnson." "I'm Clara Johnson, sir." Her voice was quiet, expectant of bad news because that's what visits from white men usually brought. "Is your daughter here? Miss Lydia Johnson?" Clara's hand tightened on the doorframe. "What's this about? Is she in trouble?" "Sir, if she did something wrong at the Institute, I promise she won't go back. I told her to stay in the storage room while I clean, to not touch anything, but sometimes she wanders. Children get curious. It won't happen again. She's not in trouble, Mrs. Johnson. Quite the opposite. I need to speak with her about something she did. Something she did." Those words seemed to drain the remaining color from Clara's face. She stepped back, opening the door wider, resigned to whatever consequences were coming. The room was small, perhaps 12 feet square, with a single window that looked out onto a brick wall. A narrow bed stood against one wall, a small table with two mismatched chairs occupied the center, and in the corner, a pile of blankets on the floor suggested where the child slept. The space was spotlessly clean, the poverty absolute but dignified. A colored girl sat at the table, her attention focused on something in her lap. She was small for 13, her frame thin in a way that spoke of meals often skipped so her mother could eat. Her skin was dark brown, her hair plaited tightly against her skull, her dress a faded calico that had been let out multiple times as she grew. When she looked up at Webb, he saw her eyes, wide and dark, and containing something that made him profoundly uncomfortable. They were eyes that looked at him and through him simultaneously, eyes that seemed to be calculating something he couldn't perceive. "Lydia, this is Professor Webb from MIT. He wants to talk to you." Clara's voice carried a warning underneath. "Be respectful, be small, don't give them reasons." "Good afternoon, sir." Lydia's voice was barely above a whisper. She stood, setting aside what she'd been holding, a piece of newspaper that she'd been studying. Webb moved closer, curious. The newspaper page showed an advertisement for agricultural equipment, but Lydia had covered the margins with tiny mathematical notations, numbers and symbols written in pencil so small they were barely legible. "Miss Johnson, I want to ask you about something that happened last Tuesday night at the Institute. The foreman, Mr. Hendricks, found you in one of our laboratories. Do you remember?" Lydia's gaze dropped to the floor. "Yes, sir." "I'm sorry, sir. I know I shouldn't have been there. What were you doing?" "I was looking at the blackboard, sir. The one with the bridge equations." "Why?" The question seemed to confuse her, as if the answer was obvious. "Because they were wrong, sir. The professors had made a mistake in the third step, and everything after that was wrong because of it. It was like a building with a broken foundation. I could see it was going to collapse." Webb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "You could see the error?" "Yes, sir." "Can you explain what was wrong?" Lydia glanced at her mother, seeking permission. Clara nodded slightly, though her expression suggested she had no idea what her daughter was about to say. "The professors were treating the wind force as if it came from a single direction, but wind doesn't work like that. It spirals and changes, so you can't use a simple vector. You have to account for the rotation and the time variance. I've watched wind move through the city. I've seen how it pushes against buildings and bridges. It's not simple. It's complex." She said this as if describing something she could see in front of her, as if the mathematics of wind and force were visible phenomena that anyone could observe if they just looked properly. Webb pulled out his notebook. "Miss Johnson, I'm going to write down some problems. I want you to look at them and tell me if you can solve them. Over the next 2 hours, In that freezing boarding house room, Harrison Webb conducted what would become one of the most significant intellectual examinations of the 19th century. He started with simple arithmetic, problems that any educated 12-year-old could handle. Lydia solved them instantly, barely glancing at the paper. He progressed to algebra, then geometry, then trigonometry. She worked through everything without hesitation, often providing answers before he finished writing the problems. Her methods were sometimes unconventional, approaches that Webb had never seen before, but her answers were flawless. Then he moved into advanced mathematics, calculus, differential equations, complex theoretical problems that his graduate students struggled with. Lydia's pace never slowed. She would look at a problem, her eyes would track across the numbers in a way that suggested she was seeing something beyond the symbols themselves, and then she would provide the solution. Sometimes he would ask if she could show him how she saw it, and when he agreed, she would draw strange diagrams, visual representations of mathematical relationships that were simultaneously alien and perfectly logical. "Where did you learn this?" Webb asked, after she'd correctly solved a problem in fluid dynamics that had taken him 2 days to work through when he was a doctoral student. "I didn't learn it, sir. I just see it." "What do you mean you see it?" Lydia struggled to explain, her young voice searching for words to describe something that shouldn't be possible. "When I look at numbers, sir, I don't see what other people see. I see shapes. Patterns. Mathematics isn't symbols on paper for me. It's like architecture in my head. I can see how numbers fit together, how forces balance, how systems work. When I look at an equation, I'm seeing the shape of what it's describing. The bridge problem. I could see the bridge in my head, see the forces acting on it, see how the mathematics had to bend to match the reality of the structure. Does that make sense?" It made no sense. It made terrible, revolutionary sense. Webb had heard of savants, individuals with highly specific talents, calculating prodigies who could multiply enormous numbers in their heads but couldn't understand why the calculations worked. But Lydia wasn't a savant. She understood the underlying principles. She could explain her reasoning. She could apply her abilities to novel problems. This wasn't idiot-savant syndrome. This was genuine, profound mathematical genius, the kind that appeared perhaps once in a generation, and it had manifested in a colored girl living in poverty, daughter of a cleaning woman, who had somehow taught herself advanced mathematics simply by observing the world around her. "How do you know about physics, about engineering?" Webb asked. "From watching, sir. Mama cleans at MIT 5 nights a week. I go with her because she can't leave me alone here. It's not safe. I'm supposed to stay in the supply closet while she works. But sometimes I walk around when the buildings are empty. I look at the blackboards. I read the books left open on desks. I watch how things work, how machines move, how bridges hold weight, and I see the mathematics underneath it all. It's like the world is made of numbers and forces, and I can see the equations that make everything happen." Clara had been standing silently by the door, watching her daughter with an expression of fear and pride intertwined. Now she spoke, her voice strained. "Is she wrong in the head, Professor? The other mothers, they say she's strange, that it's not natural for a child to think the way she does. I've been worried, sir, that something's not right with her." Webb looked at this woman who had no education herself, who worked brutal hours cleaning other people's dirt, who was asking if her daughter's brilliance was a disease. "Mrs. Johnson, your daughter is not wrong in the head. She's extraordinary. She has abilities that I've never encountered in my entire career. She's solving problems that trained mathematicians can't solve. She's understanding concepts that require years of university education to grasp, and she's doing it naturally, as if her mind operates on a different level than the rest of us." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Is that good or bad, sir?" And there was the question, wasn't it? In a world that believed colored people were intellectually inferior, that used that supposed inferiority to justify segregation and disenfranchisement, that built its entire social hierarchy on the assumption that people like Clara and Lydia Johnson were fundamentally less capable than white people, What did it mean to discover a colored child whose abilities exceeded those of the most educated white men? Was that good or bad? I don't know, Webb admitted. But I need to understand it. I need to test her more extensively, document her abilities, try to understand how her mind works. Will it help her? Clara asked, cutting through all the scientific fascination to the only question that mattered to a mother. Will whatever you do help my daughter have a better life? Webb wanted to say yes. He wanted to promise that revealing Lydia's abilities would open doors, would prove to the world that intelligence had no color, would force society to acknowledge that its racial theories were lies. But he'd lived in this world long enough to know better. I honestly don't know, Mrs. Johnson, but I can promise you this: I will do everything in my power to ensure that she's protected, that she's not exploited, that her abilities are used to help her, not to harm her. Clara looked at her daughter, at this child who saw the world in equations, who had been blessed or cursed with a mind that wouldn't stop calculating. Lydia, baby, what do you want? Lydia's answer was simple, devastating in its simplicity. I want to learn, Mama. I want to understand more. The mathematics I can see, it's like I'm looking at a book with half the pages missing. I can see some of it, but there's so much more I know exists, but can't see yet because I haven't learned the language for it. I want to know the rest. How could a mother deny her child that? How could anyone who claimed to care about knowledge and truth deny a mind like this the chance to develop? All right, Clara said finally. But Professor Webb, if this goes wrong, if they hurt her or use her or try to take her from me, I'll run. I'll take her and we'll disappear, and you'll never find us. You understand? I understand. 1. Webb returned to MIT and immediately wrote to 3 colleagues whose judgment he trusted, asking them to come to Boston to verify what he'd found. Within 2 weeks, 3 of America's leading mathematicians had made the journey to that boarding house room. All 3 emerged shaken, convinced, unable to explain what they'd witnessed. Lydia Johnson could solve any mathematical problem they presented. She could visualize complex spatial relationships. She could understand abstract theoretical concepts that shouldn't be accessible to someone without formal training. And perhaps most remarkable, she could extend existing theories, suggesting new approaches and methods that, when the professors checked them later, proved to be valid innovations. She wasn't just mimicking or memorizing, she was creating, genuinely advancing mathematical thought. By February, word had begun to spread through academic circles. Not publicly, not yet, but in the careful correspondence between scholars, the whispered conversations at conferences. There's a colored girl in Boston. Webb found her. You have to see it to believe it. And with that spreading awareness came the inevitable question that would define everything that followed. What do we do with her? MIT's Board of Trustees met in emergency session on February 18, 1897. Professor Webb presented his findings, bringing with him documentation of Lydia's abilities, testimonials from the visiting mathematicians, and a proposal. The institute should provide Lydia with formal education, perhaps a special tutorial arrangement, since admitting a colored female student would be impossible given current policies. They should study her, yes, but gently, respectfully, in ways that would help her develop her abilities while protecting her from exploitation. The board's response was more complicated than Webb had anticipated. Half the trustees saw Lydia as a scientific opportunity, a chance to understand the origins of mathematical genius, potentially to prove that intelligence transcended race. The other half saw her as a problem. If word got out that a Negro child was intellectually superior to white graduates of MIT, it would challenge everything that justified the current social order. It would be ammunition for integrationists, for those radicals who wanted to overthrow segregation and force racial mixing. It would embarrass the institute, raise questions about their admissions policies, potentially alienate Southern donors and students. The compromise they reached satisfied no one. Lydia would be allowed to study at MIT, but only in complete secrecy. She would come at night when no students were present. She would work with select professors who understood the sensitivity of the situation. Under no circumstances would her existence be publicly acknowledged. She would be a ghost, a shadow, permitted to learn, but forbidden to exist officially. Webb agreed, because it was better than nothing. Clara agreed, because her daughter would finally get the education she'd been desperate for. Lydia agreed, because she didn't yet understand that being brilliant and colored and female in 1897 America meant that her mind would always be treated as either a threat to be suppressed or a curiosity to be studied, but never simply as a person with gifts to be nurtured. The arrangement began in March. 3 nights a week, after Clara finished her cleaning work, Lydia would enter the mathematics building through a service entrance and make her way to a small classroom where Webb and occasionally other faculty members would wait. They would present her with problems, teach her formal mathematical language for concepts she already understood intuitively, and watch in awe as she absorbed years of education in weeks. She learned calculus in a month, differential equations in 2 weeks, theoretical physics in 6 weeks. She read Newton's Principia and found errors that had gone unnoticed for 2 centuries. She looked at emerging work on electromagnetism and suggested modifications to Maxwell's equations that predicted phenomena that wouldn't be experimentally verified for another decade. She was, quite simply, the most remarkable mathematical mind that any of them had ever encountered, and she was forbidden to exist. But secrets like this don't stay secret. By April, rumors had reached beyond academic circles. A reporter from the Boston Globe, following whispers about strange nighttime activities at MIT, began asking questions. Southern newspapers, always alert to anything that might challenge racial hierarchies, picked up the story in garbled form, reports of Negro genius in the North, probably abolitionist propaganda, probably a hoax. Scientific journals began receiving letters demanding clarification. And, in Virginia, a man named Dr. Marcus Thorne, who had built his career on craniometric research, proving Negro intellectual inferiority, read about Lydia Johnson and became obsessed with disproving her existence. Thorne was 53 years old, a physician by training, a racial theorist by passion. He had published extensively on skull measurements, brain weights, facial angles, all the pseudo-scientific apparatus that white supremacy had dressed in the clothes of objective research. His work was cited in legal decisions upholding segregation, in political speeches justifying disenfranchisement, in popular books explaining why racial hierarchy was natural and inevitable. And now this girl in Boston threatened to demolish everything he'd built. If a Negro child could demonstrate mathematical abilities superior to educated white men, then the fundamental premise of racial science, that intelligence was biologically determined by race, was false. Thorne couldn't allow that. He wrote to MIT's Board of Trustees demanding access to examine Lydia, to verify her abilities, to determine whether this was genuine genius or some elaborate trick. His letter carried an implicit threat. If MIT refused to allow proper scientific examination, Thorne would publicly claim they were perpetrating a fraud, using a trained child to manufacture false evidence of Negro intelligence for political purposes. The board, trapped between competing pressures, made another compromise. They would allow a controlled examination by a panel of outside scientists, including Thorne, to verify Lydia's abilities and determine their significance. Webb argued against this. He'd read Thorne's work, he knew the man's agenda, but the board overruled him. Better to allow the examination and let the truth speak for itself than to appear to be hiding something. The examination was scheduled for May 15th, 1897. And Professor Harrison Webb, who had discovered Lydia Johnson and promised to protect her, could feel control of the situation slipping from his hands, could sense that something terrible was approaching, something he would be powerless to prevent. But he had no idea just how terrible it would become, or how far men would go to suppress a truth that threatened their entire worldview. And that is where we must pause. The examination room they chose was on MIT's third floor, a space normally used for advanced laboratory work, now cleared of equipment and arranged like a courtroom. A long table at one end seated the examination panel. Dr. Marcus Thorne from Virginia, Dr. Edmund Cartwright from Yale's Department of Psychology, Professor Lawrence Hamilton from Harvard's Medical School, and two representatives from MIT's own faculty. Professor Webb sat to the side, technically present as an observer, practically powerless. At the room's center stood a smaller desk, a single chair, and nothing else. This is where Lydia would sit, isolated, visible from all angles, subject to scrutiny from every direction. Lydia Johnson waited outside in the hallway, forbidden from entering. The board had decided that her presence might somehow influence the examination, as if a cleaning woman could secretly signal advanced mathematical solutions to her daughter. When Lydia entered, escorted by a stern-faced administrator, the five men at the table fell silent, studying her with the clinical detachment they might apply to an unusual specimen under glass. She wore her best dress, which was still worn and patched, her hair plaited so tightly it pulled at her scalp. She was 13 years old, barely 5 feet tall, 70 pounds at most, walking into a room full of white men who had the power to define her entire existence. Webb watched her face, looking for fear, but what he saw instead was that strange analytical expression she wore when confronting a mathematical problem, as if she was calculating the dimensions of the trap she'd walked into. "Sit down, girl," Thorne said, not bothering with her name. Lydia sat, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight despite the chair being slightly too large for her frame. Thorne opened a leather folder, withdrawing several pages of notes. "We are here to conduct a scientific examination of the claims made regarding your supposed intellectual abilities. You will answer our questions truthfully and completely. You will solve the problems we present. You will submit to physical examination if required. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Let us begin with basic questions to establish your background. Can you read?" "Yes, sir." "Who taught you?" "I taught myself, sir. By looking at books and newspapers, matching the words to sounds I knew." "You expect us to believe you simply taught yourself to read with no instruction?" "I don't expect anything, sir. You asked me a question and I answered it truthfully." There was something in her tone, not quite defiance, but an absence of the submission that Thorne expected from colored children. His jaw tightened slightly. "Can you write?" "Yes, sir." "Demonstrate." They provided her with paper and pen. Lydia wrote her name, then a sentence Thorne dictated. "The examination of racial characteristics requires objective scientific methodology." Her handwriting was careful, slightly cramped, the letters formed with precision if not elegance. Thorne examined the paper, then passed it to his colleagues. "Adequate," he said dismissively, as if grudging even this minor acknowledgement. "Now, we will proceed to mathematical assessment. Dr. Cartwright will present the first problem." Cartwright was younger than Thorne, perhaps 40, with the bland handsomeness of someone who had never encountered serious opposition to his views. He opened his own folder, selected a page, and read aloud. "A train leaves Boston, traveling west at 40 miles per hour. 2 hours later, a second train leaves Boston, traveling west at 60 miles per hour. How long will it take the second train to overtake the first?" It was a problem that any decent student of algebra could solve, the kind of question designed to establish baseline competence. Lydia answered, before Cartwright finished reading. 3 hours, Cartwright blinked. "You need to show your work. The first train travels for 2 hours before the second train starts, covering 80 miles. The second train is 20 miles per hour faster, so it closes the gap at 20 miles per hour. 80 divided by 20 equals 4 hours of travel time for the second train, but you asked how long after the second train departs, so it's 3 hours. Cartwright checked his notes. "That's correct, but you should write out the equations. If you want me to write them, I will, sir. But you asked for the answer, and I gave it to you." The examination continued for the next hour, progressing through increasingly difficult mathematics, algebra, geometry, trigonometry, calculus. Each time, Lydia would listen to the problem, sometimes ask for clarification of what exactly they wanted her to find, then provide the answer with minimal delay. The panel began glancing at each other, the kind of looks that pass between people who are witnessing something they can't quite process. Webb watched Thorne's expression shift from confident superiority to confusion, to something darker, anger perhaps, or fear. Around the second hour, Thorne took over the questioning directly. "These are parlor tricks," he announced. "Memorization and training. The girl has been coached to perform these calculations. We need to test genuine understanding, not rote responses." He withdrew a different set of papers, problems he'd prepared specifically for this examination, complex theoretical questions that couldn't be solved through memorization because they required real understanding of underlying principles. Here is a problem in advanced mechanics. A bridge span of 200 feet is supported by cables arranged in a parabolic curve. Given the following specifications for cable tension, deck weight, and load distribution, calculate the maximum safe load the bridge can support under sustained wind pressure of 30 miles per hour. He read out a series of specifications, numbers and measurements that would take even a trained engineer time to organize and understand. Lydia listened, her eyes tracking slightly, as if following invisible calculations in the air in front of her. "Sir, I need to clarify something before I answer." "What?" "Are you asking for theoretical maximum load based on the cable specifications alone, or practical maximum load accounting for deck stress distribution and connection point failure risks?" Thorne stared at her. "Explain the difference. The cables themselves might be able to support a certain weight, but if that weight is distributed unevenly, or if the connection points where the cables attached to the deck aren't reinforced properly, the bridge will fail at a lower load than the cables alone could theoretically handle." Engineering isn't just about individual components, it's about how systems interact. So which calculation do you want? The question demonstrated understanding that went beyond simple mathematics. This was systems thinking, the ability to see how multiple factors interacted, the kind of conceptual sophistication that separated competent engineers from brilliant ones. "Both," Thorne said finally. "Give me both calculations." Lydia closed her eyes for perhaps 30 seconds, her lips moving slightly as if speaking to herself. Then she opened them and began to recite numbers, explaining her methodology as she went, describing how she was visualizing the bridge structure, how she was accounting for force distribution, how she was calculating stress factors at critical points. She provided two numbers, one for theoretical maximum based on cable strength alone, another lower number for practical maximum, accounting for system vulnerabilities. The panel sat in stunned silence. Finally, Hamilton from Harvard spoke up. "Dr. Thorne, do you have the solutions to these problems?" "Of course." "Are her answers correct?" Thorne checked his notes, taking longer than necessary, clearly hoping to find an error. His face darkened as he compared Lydia's answers to his own calculations. "The first answer is correct. The second answer uses a methodology I hadn't considered, but appears to be valid." "Appears to be?" Webb couldn't stay silent any longer. "Either the mathematics is sound or it isn't. The mathematics may be sound, but that doesn't prove she derived it independently. She could have been taught these specific problems." "Then give her a problem she hasn't seen," Webb shot back. "Give her something original, something you create right now that couldn't possibly have been anticipated." Thorne's expression suggested this was exactly what he wanted. He stood, moving to the blackboard mounted on one wall, and began writing. He spent 15 minutes constructing a problem, a complex scenario involving fluid dynamics, pressure calculations, and three-dimensional spatial reasoning. It was the kind of problem that would appear in an advanced physics examination, the kind that graduate students would spend an hour solving with access to reference books and calculation tools. When he finished, he turned to Lydia. "Solve this." She studied the board for several minutes, her head tilting slightly, that strange, unfocused gaze, suggesting she was seeing something beyond the symbols written in chalk. Then she stood, walked to the board and asked, "May I show my work here, sir?" "Please do." What followed was, for Webb, one of the most remarkable demonstrations of mathematical thinking he had ever witnessed. Lydia didn't just solve the problem, she restructured it, finding a more elegant approach than the one Thorne had anticipated, using visual representations that made complex relationships suddenly clear. She drew diagrams showing force vectors. She noted simplifying assumptions that could be made without sacrificing accuracy. She caught an error in Thorne's original setup, where he'd accidentally used the wrong unit conversion. And she explained everything in simple language, teaching as she solved, making her thinking visible and comprehensible. When she finished, she set down the chalk and returned to her seat, leaving the board covered in her work. The room was silent except for the sound of breathing and the distant noise of the city outside. Professor Hamilton rose and approached the board, examining Lydia's work closely. He traced her logic, checked her calculations, studied her diagrams. Finally, he turned to face his colleagues. "Gentlemen, I don't know how to say this delicately, so I'll be blunt. This is legitimate genius. This isn't training or memorization or some kind of trick. This girl understands advanced mathematics at a level that I rarely see in doctoral candidates. She's not just solving problems, she's demonstrating genuine creative mathematical thinking." "Impossible," Thorne said flatly. "There must be some explanation, some technique she's using to create the illusion of understanding." "What explanation do you propose?" Hamilton challenged. "That Professor Webb spent months training her to solve thousands of potential problems so she could perform on demand? That she somehow memorized approaches to problems she'd never seen? Be reasonable, Marcus. Sometimes the evidence forces us to revise our theories. My theories are based on decades of craniometric research, on measurements of thousands of specimens, on documented biological differences between the races." "Then perhaps your theories are wrong." The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Thorne's face flushed red, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I will not have my life's work dismissed because of some anomaly. Science is about understanding the general rule, not being distracted by outliers." "She's not an outlier," Webb interjected. "Or rather, she is, but not in the way you think. She's an outlier in human cognition generally, not in Negro cognition specifically. What she proves is that the capacity for this kind of genius exists across racial lines, that our theories about fixed racial intellectual hierarchies are built on false premises." "You want to overturn the entire scientific establishment based on one girl?" Thorne demanded. "I want to acknowledge the truth based on the evidence in front of us. Isn't that what science is supposed to be?" The examination continued for another 3 hours, but the battle lines had been drawn. Hamilton and Cartwright, though clearly unsettled by the implications, acknowledged that Lydia's abilities were genuine and extraordinary. The two MIT representatives hedged, suggesting more study was needed before drawing conclusions. And Thorne became increasingly hostile, his questions taking on an edge that moved from scientific inquiry toward interrogation. He demanded Lydia solve problems in her head without writing anything down, then accused her of using some kind of memory technique when she succeeded. He presented deliberately unsolvable problems with contradictory specifications, then accused her of being uncooperative when she pointed out the logical impossibilities. He began asking questions designed not to test her abilities but to humiliate her, asking about her living conditions, her mother's work, whether she'd ever stolen books or sneaked into places she wasn't allowed. "Sir," Lydia said finally, her voice still quiet, but carrying a hint of steel underneath, "are you examining my mathematical abilities, or are you trying to prove I'm a bad person who doesn't deserve to have them? I'm trying to determine whether you understand the significance of what's being claimed about you. Do you realize that if we acknowledge your abilities as genuine, it would challenge fundamental theories about racial capacity? I know what you believe about people who look like me, sir. I've heard it my whole life. I've been told I'm inferior, that my brain is smaller, that I'm suited only for manual labor, but mathematics doesn't care what you believe. 2 plus 2 equals 4, whether a white man or a colored girl says it. The bridge equations don't change based on who's solving them. Truth exists independently of who's convenient for it to exist for. The room went dead silent. A 13-year-old Negro girl had just lectured a panel of white scientists about objective truth, and she'd done it with such simple logic that there was no immediate rebuttal. Thorne's face went through several shades of red. "You're impertinent." "I'm honest, sir. You asked me a question and I answered it. You need to learn your place. I thought my place was sitting in this chair solving whatever problems you gave me. That's what Professor Webb told me this examination was for. If you wanted me to be quiet and submissive, you should have said that was being tested too." Webb wanted to applaud and shout at her simultaneously. She was right, devastatingly right, but she was also a colored child, speaking to white men with authority, and that was dangerous in ways that mathematics couldn't protect her from. Hamilton cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess. This has been an intensive examination, and I think we all need to collect our thoughts before proceeding to physical measurements." Physical measurements. Webb's stomach dropped. He'd been dreading this part. Craniometry, the measurement of skull size and shape, was considered essential to any scientific examination of intelligence in 1897. Thorne would want to measure Lydia's head, compare her skull dimensions to his charts and tables, try to find some physical explanation for her abilities that didn't threaten his theories about racial hierarchy. And there was no good outcome. If her skull measurements were unremarkable, Thorne would use that to argue her abilities must be fraudulent because genuine intelligence required certain physical characteristics. If her measurements were unusual, she'd become a specimen to be studied, poked, prodded, possibly even subjected to more invasive examinations. During the recess, Webb found Clara in the hallway. She stood when she saw him, her face tight with worry. "How is she?" "Holding her own. She's brilliant, Clara. She's proving everything we knew about her abilities, but that's making it worse in some ways." "What do you mean?" "Half the men in there are convinced she's extraordinary. The other half are terrified of what that means, and frightened men are dangerous." Clara grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Professor Webb, if they try to hurt her, if they try to take her from me, you have to help us get away. I can't let them turn my baby into some kind of exhibit. It won't come to that. You can't promise that. You're a good man, Professor, I can tell. But you're one person, and they're the whole world. If the whole world decides it needs to suppress what Lydia is, what can one good man do?" It was the question that would haunt Webb for the rest of his life. When they reconvened, Thorne had regained his composure, though his eyes held something cold and calculating. "We need to proceed to anthropometric measurements." Standard craniometric protocol. He withdrew a set of calipers from his bag, metal instruments designed to measure skull dimensions with precision. "Miss Johnson, if you would stand and come here." Lydia looked at Webb, seeking some signal about whether this was safe. He had no signal to give her. She stood and approached Thorne, her small frame tense. "This won't hurt," Thorne said, though his tone suggested he didn't particularly care whether it did. "I'm going to measure various aspects of your skull structure. Hold still." He positioned the calipers against her head, measuring from different angles, calling out numbers that Cartwright recorded in a notebook. Maximum cranial length, cranial breadth, cranial height, facial measurements, angles and proportions. The process took 20 minutes, during which Lydia stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on some distant point, her jaw clenched. When Thorne finished, he studied his notes with an expression of deep frustration. "The measurements are within normal ranges for her age and sex. Cranial capacity appears adequate, though of course we cannot determine brain weight without dissection." The casual mention of dissection, as if Lydia were already a corpse to be studied, made Webb's blood run cold. "That won't be necessary," he said sharply. "We're examining a living child, not preparing a cadaver for autopsy. Obviously, we cannot dissect a living subject," Thorne replied with exaggerated patience. But it does limit our ability to draw definitive conclusions about the physical basis of her supposed abilities. There's nothing supposed about them. You've spent 5 hours watching her solve problems that most people couldn't solve with weeks of study. At what point does the evidence become sufficient? Evidence is meaningless without proper theoretical framework. Yes, the girl can perform mathematical operations. That's documented. But what does it mean? Is this genuine intelligence or some form of savant syndrome, an isolated ability divorced from general reasoning capacity? Is this a unique case or evidence of broader patterns we've failed to observe? Can these abilities be reliably transmitted to offspring, or are they a genetic anomaly? These are the questions that matter scientifically. Those questions all assume she's here to be studied like a lab specimen instead of educated like a human being with extraordinary gifts. She's a Negro, Thorne said flatly. Her education or lack thereof is not my concern. My concern is understanding the scientific implications of her case for our theories of racial intelligence. And there it was, stated plainly. Lydia wasn't a person to Thorne. She was data, a problem to be solved, an inconvenience to be explained away or absorbed into existing frameworks that kept the racial hierarchy intact. Hamilton spoke up, his tone careful. Dr. Thorne, I think we need to acknowledge that this examination has demonstrated genuine, extraordinary abilities. The question is what we do with that information. We study her further, Thorne said immediately. Comprehensive testing over an extended period, multiple examinations by different researchers, documentation of her development over time. This is too significant to be resolved in a single day. You want to turn her into a permanent research subject, Webb said. I want to pursue proper scientific investigation. Surely you understand that this case demands thorough study. What I understand is that you want to lock a 13-year-old girl in a laboratory and test her until you either explain away her abilities or she breaks under the pressure. Don't be dramatic. We're not discussing anything harmful. Simple observation and testing. Simple observation that would require removing her from her home, separating her from her mother, making her entire existence about satisfying your scientific curiosity. The argument escalated, voices rising, the 5 men talking over each other. And in the middle of it all, Lydia stood silently, listening to them debate her future as if she weren't present, as if she had no say in what happened to her own life. Finally she spoke, her voice cutting through the argument with unexpected force. "Excuse me, sirs." They fell silent, surprised that she'd spoken without being addressed. "I have a question." "This is not the time," Thorne began. "When is the time, sir? You've been examining me for 7 hours. You've tested my mathematics, measured my head, discussed what it means that I can do what I can do. But nobody's asked me what I want." "What you want is irrelevant," Thorne said. "You're a minor, and more importantly, you're in no position to understand the scientific significance of your own case." "I'm in no position? Sir, I understand mathematics that you had to study for years to grasp. I can see patterns and relationships that took humanity thousands of years to discover. I taught myself to read and write because I knew I needed language to make sense of the mathematics in my head. I may be 13 and colored and female, but I'm not stupid about my own life. So I'll ask again, does anyone care what I want?" Hamilton cleared his throat. "What do you want, Miss Johnson?" "I want to learn. I want access to books and teachers and problems I haven't seen before. I want to understand all the mathematics I can see, but don't have names for yet. I want to use what I can do to build things, to solve real problems, to make something that matters. I don't want to be locked in a room being measured and tested and studied like I'm some kind of animal that learned a trick." "That's not what scientific research," Thorne started. "That's exactly what it is, sir. You don't see me as a person. You see me as evidence for or against your theories. And I understand why. If I'm real, if I'm genuinely this intelligent, then everything you've written about racial inferiority is wrong. All those measurements you've done, All those conclusions you've published, all the laws and policies that rely on your research, it's all built on lies. That's why you're so angry. Not because you don't believe I can do what I've proven I can do, but because you can't afford to believe it." The silence that followed was absolute. A 13-year-old Negro girl had just articulated the unspoken heart of the matter with crystalline clarity, and no one in the room had a response ready. Thorne's face was purple now, his hands shaking slightly. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. "You have no idea what you're talking about. I understand more than you think, sir. I understand that you're scared. I understand that admitting I'm right means destroying your reputation. I understand that powerful men don't like being proved wrong by powerless girls. But I also understand mathematics, and mathematics teaches you that truth doesn't care about your feelings. Either my proof is correct or it isn't. Either my answers are right or they're wrong. You can't change the mathematics to make yourself more comfortable. You can only accept it or lie about it." Webb watched Thorne's expression and recognized the look of a man who had just decided something. This wasn't the face of someone admitting defeat. This was the face of someone planning how to eliminate a threat. "Gentlemen," Thorne said, his voice now perfectly controlled, "I move that we conclude this examination. We have sufficient data to write our preliminary reports. I suggest we reconvene in 1 month to discuss our findings and recommendations." It was a tactical retreat, a way to exit the situation without admitting anything. The panel agreed, everyone relieved to escape the tension. As they gathered their materials, Thorne approached Webb with a thin smile. "Professor Webb, I'm sure you understand that further security measures will be necessary. The girl's location needs to remain confidential while we complete our assessment." "Security from what?" "From exploitation, from premature publicity, from those who might seek to use her for political purposes before we've established scientific consensus about what she represents. I'll be writing to MIT's board recommending that access to her be carefully restricted." It sounded reasonable. It sounded like protection. But Webb heard the real message. Thorne wanted to control access to Lydia, to ensure that only researchers who shared his agenda could examine her, to manage the narrative about what her abilities meant. When Webb left the examination room, he found Clara waiting with a desperation in her eyes that spoke of hours of helpless worry. "Is she all right?" "Physically, yes. But Clara, I need to talk to you about something. Not here. Somewhere private." They collected Lydia, who emerged from the examination room looking exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. Webb led them to his office, locked the door, and told them what he feared was coming. Dr. Thorne is going to try to take control of this situation. He's going to argue that Lydia needs to be in a controlled research environment, that she's too significant to be left unsupervised, and I don't know if I can stop him. "Then we run," Clara said immediately. "We leave Boston tonight." "Where would you go?" "Thorne has connections throughout the academic world. If he decides you're fugitives, he can have people looking for you in every city." "So what do you suggest?" Clara's voice was sharp with fear and anger. "That we just hand my daughter over to be studied like a bug under glass? No. I suggest we be strategic. We document everything. We build a coalition of researchers who acknowledge Lydia's abilities and oppose treating her as a specimen. We go public if we have to. Make enough noise that Thorne can't simply make her disappear. And if that doesn't work, then yes, you run. And I'll help you. I'll give you money, contacts, whatever you need, but let's try the official path first. Sometimes institutions can be forced to do the right thing if you apply enough pressure from the right directions." It was an optimistic assessment, and Webb knew it. But what was the alternative? Tell a mother and daughter to flee into a world that had no place for them, that offered no protection for brilliant colored girls who challenged every assumption about who deserved to be called human? Lydia spoke for the first time since leaving the examination room. "Professor Webb, how long do we have before they try something?" "I don't know. Days, maybe. A week at most." Then, I need to learn as much as I can in that time. If they take me somewhere I can't study, if they lock me away, I want my mind to be as full as possible. I want to know enough that even if they silence me, I'll have the mathematics inside my head where they can't take it away. Can you teach me, every day until whatever's going to happen happens? Webb looked at this child who had already grasped that her brilliance had made her a target, who understood that she was in a race to fill her mind before the world found a way to empty it. How could he say no? Yes, every day. We'll work as long as you can focus. I'll teach you everything I know. And so began what Webb would later call the most intense educational experience of his career. For the next 12 days, he met with Lydia for 6 to 8 hours daily, teaching her advanced mathematics, physics, engineering principles, everything he could compress into the time they had. She absorbed it all with that same frightening capacity she demonstrated from the beginning, understanding in hours what should take months, making connections he'd never seen, asking questions that revealed depths he hadn't imagined. But underneath the intellectual excitement, they all felt the clock ticking, felt the weight of borrowed time, knew that somewhere Dr. Marcus Thorne was planning his next move. On May 28th, 1897, that move came. Webb arrived at the boarding house to find it surrounded by police. Lydia Johnson was being restrained by 2 officers while she screamed for her daughter. And Lydia was being led into a closed carriage by men in dark coats, her hands bound, her face blank with shock. Webb ran forward shouting, demanding to know what authority they had. One of the officers showed him papers signed by a judge, declaring Lydia Johnson a ward of the state, subject to immediate protective custody for her own welfare. The justification: her mother was deemed unfit to care for a child with special medical needs, those needs being undefined but sufficient to warrant removal. It was all legal, all proper, all completely destroying everything Webb had promised to prevent. "Where are you taking her?" he demanded. "To a private medical facility where she can receive appropriate care," one of the men in dark coats replied. He had the bland efficiency of someone carrying out orders without questioning them. "She'll be evaluated by specialists, given proper treatment, kept safe." "Safe from what?" Clara screamed. "I'm her mother. She's safe with me." "Ma'am, the state has determined that your daughter's condition requires professional supervision. Please don't make this more difficult." They loaded Lydia into the carriage. As the door closed, she looked back at Webb and her mother, and in her eyes, Webb saw something that would haunt him forever. Not fear, not anger, but a terrible understanding that this was always how it was going to end. That brilliance and blackness and being female in 1897 America meant that someone would eventually decide you needed to be controlled, studied, or suppressed. The carriage pulled away. Clara collapsed, sobbing. Webb stood helpless, watching genius being kidnapped in broad daylight under color of law, and he knew with sick certainty that Dr. Marcus Thorne had found a way to get exactly what he wanted. Lydia Johnson would disappear into a medical facility where she could be studied in isolation, where no one would hear her voice or recognize her humanity, where her extraordinary mind would be treated as a specimen to be examined, explained, or explained away. But Webb was wrong about one thing. What Thorne planned for Lydia was far worse than simple isolation and study. And what would happen over the next 6 months would force Webb to make choices that would destroy his career, challenge his faith in institutions, and ultimately ask whether one brilliant child was worth burning down everything he'd built his life upon. The facility was called Brightwater Institute, a name deliberately chosen to suggest healing and hope rather than imprisonment and experimentation. It sat on 40 acres of isolated land in western Massachusetts, surrounded by stone walls and iron gates, accessible only by a single private road that wound through dense forest. From the outside, it looked almost pastoral, a large manor house converted to institutional use with manicured grounds and flowering gardens, but the windows on the upper floors had bars. the doors locked from the outside, and the screaming that sometimes carried across those carefully maintained lawns suggested that whatever happened inside Brightwater had nothing to do with healing. Professor Harrison Webb spent the first week after Lydia's abduction trying every official channel available to him. He appealed to MIT's Board of Trustees, arguing that the institute had a moral obligation to protect her. They expressed sympathy but explained they had no legal standing to challenge a state custody order. He contacted lawyers, but none would take a case involving a Negro child removed from her mother by state authority. He wrote to newspaper editors, but none would publish stories that challenged the legitimacy of scientific research or suggested impropriety in judicial decisions. He even traveled to the courthouse that had issued the custody order, demanding to see the evidence that Lydia Johnson was an unfit mother. The clerk had smiled with bland bureaucratic indifference and explained that such records were sealed for the child's protection. Every door closed, every avenue blocked. The system had been designed to prevent exactly the kind of intervention Webb was attempting, to ensure that once authority decided something, that decision became unquestionable. Lydia Johnson fared even worse. She lost her job at MIT, the cleaning supervisor, explaining regretfully that a woman in her emotional state couldn't be trusted around valuable equipment. She spent what little money she had on a lawyer who took her payment, filed a motion to challenge the custody order, and then disappeared when the motion was denied. She haunted the streets near Brightwater Institute until local police warned her that continued trespassing would result in arrest. She was a colored woman whose child had been taken by the state. The machinery of law and social order had determined she had no rights that anyone was bound to respect, and there was nothing she could do about it except grieve and wait and hope. Webb's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. On June 10th, he received an anonymous letter delivered to his office at MIT. The envelope contained a single page, written in a careful feminine hand. "Professor Webb, I am a nurse at Brightwater Institute. I cannot tell you my name, because I would lose my position, and worse if discovered, but I must tell someone what is happening to the Negro girl they brought here 2 weeks ago. She is being held in isolation on the 3rd floor, East Wing. She receives no visitors. She is subjected to daily examinations that she does not consent to. Dr. Thorne visits 3 times per week and conducts tests that leave her distressed and withdrawn. She barely eats. She does not sleep well. I hear her crying at night when I pass her room. Yesterday I heard her speaking to herself, reciting what sounded like mathematical proofs, over and over, as if afraid she would forget them. This is not medical care. This is captivity. I do not know what they intend to do with her, but I know it is wrong. If you care about this child, you must find a way to remove her from this place before they break her completely. God forgive me for not doing more. A friend." Webb read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking. So Lydia was alive, still conscious, still trying to hold on to herself through mathematics, but she was deteriorating. He had, perhaps weeks, maybe only days, before the psychological pressure of isolation and forced examination destroyed the very mind that made her extraordinary. He needed help, and he needed it from someone willing to operate outside legal constraints. He found that help in an unexpected place. Marcus Webb, no relation to Harrison, was a former Pinkerton agent who had left the agency after developing a conscience about some of the strike-breaking work he'd been required to do. He now worked independently, taking cases that interested him, often on behalf of people who couldn't afford legitimate legal representation. Webb, the professor, found Webb the investigator through a network of abolitionist contacts who still operated in Boston, remnants of the old Underground Railroad, who had shifted their work from helping escaped slaves to helping freed people navigate a system designed to re-enslave them through different means. "You want me to surveil a private medical facility," Marcus Webb said when Harrison Webb explained the situation. They sat in a dim tavern in Boston's North End, far from the university district where Harrison might be recognized. "That's the beginning. Eventually, I need you to help me extract a child from that facility. You're talking about kidnapping. I'm talking about rescue." She was kidnapped when they took her. What I'm proposing is liberation." Marcus studied him for a long moment. "You're a university professor. Respected, established, presumably with something to lose. Why are you willing to risk all that for a colored girl you've known for a few months?" "Because she's the most brilliant person I've ever encountered, and they're destroying her because her existence is inconvenient to their theories. Because I promised her mother I'd protect her, and I failed. Because if we live in a world where genius can be imprisoned for being the wrong color, then all our talk about civilization and progress and human dignity is just decoration on top of barbarism." "That's a good answer." Marcus pulled out a notebook. "Tell me everything you know about Brightwater Institute. Layout, staff, routines, security measures. Then tell me everything about the girl. What makes her so special that they're willing to go this far?" Over the next hour, Harrison explained Lydia's abilities, the examination, Thorne's agenda, the legal maneuvering that had resulted in her capture. Marcus listened with the focused attention of someone who had spent years gathering intelligence, asking occasional questions, making notes in a personal shorthand. When Harrison finished, Marcus sat back, his expression grim. "You understand that even if we get her out, it doesn't end there. They'll hunt for her. They'll charge you with abduction, interfering with a court order, probably a dozen other crimes. You'll lose your position, possibly face prison time. Your career will be destroyed." "I know. And the girl and her mother, they'll have to disappear completely. New names, new city, constant vigilance. That's not much of a life. It's better than what she has now. It's better than being a permanent research subject in Thorne's laboratory." Marcus nodded slowly. "All right. Give me 2 weeks to observe the facility, map out routines, identify vulnerabilities. Then we'll talk about whether extraction is feasible. But Professor, I need you to understand something. This kind of operation, there's always risk. People can get hurt. Things can go wrong in ways you can't anticipate. Are you prepared for that? What I'm not prepared for is doing nothing while a child is tortured in the name of science." "Fair enough. I'll be in touch." While Marcus Webb conducted his surveillance, Harrison tried to learn more about what was actually happening to Lydia inside Brightwater. He couldn't visit officially, but he made contact with 2 other nurses through the network of abolitionist sympathizers, women who were troubled by what they witnessed but afraid to speak openly. From them, he pieced together a picture of Lydia's daily existence that made him physically ill. She was confined to a single room, 12 feet by 12 feet, with a bed, a desk, and a chair. She was allowed no books, no paper, no writing implements except during testing sessions. Her meals were brought by staff who were instructed not to speak to her beyond basic necessities. She was examined daily by Dr. Thorne or his associates, examinations that ranged from standard medical assessments to psychological tests designed to measure her emotional state and cognitive function under stress. The nurses reported that Thorne was particularly interested in determining whether Lydia's abilities would remain stable under conditions of isolation and deprivation. He wanted to know if her mathematical genius was robust or fragile, whether it could be broken by breaking her spirit. "He talks about her like she's an experiment," one nurse whispered during a clandestine meeting in a church basement. "Not like she's a child. He takes notes on everything. How many hours she sleeps, whether she cries, how quickly she solves the problems he gives her, whether her performance degrades over time. He's not trying to help her or understand her abilities to benefit her. He's trying to understand them so he can explain them away. He keeps saying that if he can prove her abilities are unstable, emotional, prone to collapse under pressure, then he can argue they're not genuine intelligence but some kind of aberrant condition." "Has he hurt her physically?" Harrison asked, dreading the answer. "Not in ways that leave obvious marks, but the isolation is hurting her. She talks to herself constantly, reciting mathematical proofs like prayers, like she's afraid if she stops thinking about mathematics she'll forget how. She barely eats, she startles at sounds." Last week, Dr. Thorne brought in another researcher, some specialist in brain anatomy from Philadelphia. They discussed her skull measurements in her presence, debated whether her cranial capacity could explain her abilities, speculated about what an autopsy might reveal. They talked about dissecting her brain like she wasn't in the room, like she was already dead. She didn't cry until they left. Then she sobbed for hours. Harrison felt rage building in him, the kind of cold, focused anger that makes men capable of things they never imagined. How much longer can she endure this? I don't know. She's strong, stronger than most children would be. But everyone has a breaking point. Another month of this? Maybe 2? Then I think you'll have a girl who's too damaged to ever fully recover, even if you get her out. We're working on extraction. It will happen soon. It needs to happen very soon, Professor, because I've heard Thorne talking with his colleagues. He's planning something he calls the definitive test. He won't say what it is, but the way he talks about it suggests something extreme. Whatever it is, it's scheduled for the end of June, 2 weeks from now. Harrison felt ice in his stomach. Do you have any idea what this test involves? No. But Professor, you need to understand something about Dr. Thorne. He's not just a scientist pursuing knowledge. He's a man whose entire identity is built on proving Negro inferiority. This girl threatens to destroy that. And men like Thorne, when they're threatened, they don't admit they're wrong. They eliminate the threat. I don't know what his definitive test is, but I don't think it's designed to prove she's brilliant. I think it's designed to prove she's broken. Harrison met with Marcus Webb the following day. The investigator had completed his surveillance and had news, some good, some troubling. The facility has security, but it's not particularly sophisticated, Marcus explained, spreading hand-drawn maps across Harrison's desk. 4 guards on rotation, but they're not military. They're local men hired for intimidation value, not actual defense. The perimeter wall is stone, 8 feet high, climbable with minimal equipment. Most importantly, there's a service entrance on the east side used for deliveries. It's locked, but the lock is simple. I could open it in under a minute. When can we go? Hold on. There are complications. First, we need to know exactly which room she's in. The facility has 30 rooms. If we're going in blind, trying different doors, we'll get caught. Second, we need a distraction. Something that draws the guards away from the east wing long enough for us to get in, locate her, and get out. Third, we need an exit plan. Getting her out of the building is one thing. Getting her off the property and away from immediate pursuit is another. What do you suggest? I suggest we recruit help. We need someone on the inside who can tell us her exact location and maybe create the distraction we need. Do you have contacts among the staff? Harrison thought of the nurses, women who were already taking risks by passing information. Possibly. But I can't ask them to do something that would definitely cost them their positions, and possibly worse. Then we need to make it worth their while. How much money can you access? Harrison had some savings, a small inheritance from his mother, funds he'd been setting aside for retirement. $3,000, perhaps a bit more if I sell some possessions. That's enough. Offer one of those nurses $1,000 to tell us exactly where the girl is and to create a distraction at a specific time. The remaining funds we use to get the girl and her mother out of Massachusetts entirely. New city, new identities, enough money to establish themselves somewhere the authorities won't immediately look. Where would they go? Canada, probably. Toronto has a community of freed slaves, people who understand the necessity of helping others disappear. We get them across the border, connect them with contacts there, give them enough money to start fresh. It's not perfect, but it's survivable. Over the next 3 days, Harrison negotiated with one of the nurses, a woman named Elizabeth Carr, who was deeply troubled by what she witnessed at Brightwater, but terrified of losing her position. He offered her $1,000, enough money to leave nursing entirely, to move to another city, to start over. At first, she refused, the risk too great, but Harrison appealed to her conscience, describing what would happen if they did nothing, painting a picture of a brilliant child broken by systematic psychological torture. Finally, Elizabeth agreed, but only if Harrison promised that she would never be named, that if caught, he would claim the information came from another source. He promised, though they both knew such promises might not protect her if things went wrong. Elizabeth provided crucial intelligence. Lydia was in room 307, third floor, east wing, fifth door from the stairwell on the left side of the corridor. Her door was locked, but the key was kept in a cabinet at the nurse's station, 20 feet away. The guards changed shifts at 8 p.m., a moment of vulnerability when the evening guards were just arriving and the day guards were eager to leave. Most importantly, Elizabeth agreed to create a distraction. At precisely 8:15 p.m. on June 24th, she would trigger the facility's fire alarm. It was a manual system, a pull lever that would ring bells throughout the building. The alarm would create chaos, draw the guards to investigate, and give Harrison and Marcus perhaps 5 minutes to get in, reach Lydia's room, and get out. 5 minutes isn't much, Marcus said when they reviewed the plan. It's enough. It has to be enough. They brought Lydia Johnson into the planning. She deserved to know, deserved to be part of her daughter's rescue. When Harrison explained what they intended, Clara didn't hesitate. What do you need me to do? Wait at the roadside with a wagon, half a mile from the facility entrance. We'll bring Lydia to you, and then we run. All of us. You, Lydia, and me. Marcus will stay behind, create confusion about which direction we went. Then we separate. Marcus goes his own way. We take you and Lydia to a safe house in Connecticut, then arrange passage to Canada within a week. You're coming with us? Professor, you'll lose everything. I've already decided. I can't send you into hiding while I stay here pretending nothing happened. I'm complicit in this. I need to see it through. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Why are you doing this? Really? You're a white man with position and respect. We're nothing to you. You're not nothing. Your daughter is one of the most remarkable people I've ever known. And if I stand by and watch her be destroyed because acknowledging her brilliance is inconvenient, then everything I've claimed to believe about human dignity and truth and justice is a lie. I'd rather lose my career than live that lie. The days before June 24th moved with agonizing slowness. Harrison continued his normal teaching duties, maintaining the appearance that nothing was wrong, all while making quiet preparations. He withdrew his savings in cash, converted some to traveler's checks under a false name. He packed a bag with essentials, clothes, documents, funds. He wrote letters to colleagues, sealed and dated, to be opened only if he didn't return, letters explaining what he'd done and why. He said goodbye to his life because he understood that after June 24th, Professor Harrison Webb of MIT would cease to exist. He would become Harrison Miller, or John Collins, or whatever name they chose in Canada. He would become a fugitive, a kidnapper in the eyes of the law, a man who had thrown away respectability for principle. And he found that he was more at peace with that decision than he'd been with anything in his careful, respectable academic career. June 24th, 1897, arrived with the kind of perfect summer weather that feels obscene when you're planning something terrible and necessary. Harrison and Marcus met at 3 p.m. in a rented room 2 miles from Brightwater, going through the plan one final time, checking equipment, timing each step. They would approach the facility at 7:30, using the cover of dusk. They would wait near the east service entrance until 8:15, when Elizabeth triggered the alarm. Then they would move. At 8 p.m., they were in position, hidden in the tree line near Brightwater's eastern wall. Harrison could hear his own heartbeat, loud and irregular. He'd never done anything remotely like this, never broken a law more serious than overdue library books. Now he was preparing to break into a private facility, remove a child against state authority, flee across state lines. Every instinct of his ordered, academic life screamed that this was wrong, illegal, career-ending. And yet, sitting in those trees watching the sun sink behind Brightwater's stone walls, he knew with absolute certainty that it was right. At 8:14, Marcus checked his pocket watch. 1 minute. You remember the route? East entrance, second floor service stairs, third floor, left corridor, fifth door. If anything goes wrong, if we get separated, you run. Don't wait for me. Get the girl and run. I'm not leaving without her. I know. That's what worries me. You're a good man, Professor. But good men aren't always good at the kind of ugly necessities that the fire alarm exploded into sound, bells clanging throughout Brightwater, the noise carrying across the grounds. Marcus moved immediately, running low toward the service entrance. Harrison followed, his breath harsh in his throat, his legs clumsy with adrenaline. Marcus reached the door, pulled out lockpicks, worked for 30 seconds that felt like hours. The lock clicked. They were inside. The interior was chaos, exactly as hoped. Staff running toward the alarm, guards shouting questions, patients in some rooms crying out in confusion or fear. Harrison and Marcus moved against the flow, heading for the service stairs, while everyone else converged on the supposed fire. Up the stairs, legs burning, lungs aching. Second floor. Keep going. Third floor. The corridor stretched ahead, dim and institutional, doors on both sides. Fifth door on the left. Harrison counted, his vision narrowing to that single objective. There. Room 307. He tried the handle. Locked. The keys, he gasped. Nurse's station. Marcus was already moving, 20 feet down the corridor, reaching the cabinet Elizabeth had described. He forced it open with a crowbar, grabbed a ring of keys, ran back. Tried the first key. Wrong. Second key. Wrong. Third key. The lock turned. The door opened. And Harrison Webb saw what had become of Lydia Johnson. She sat on the bed, curled into herself, her arms wrapped around her knees. She was thinner than when he'd last seen her, her face hollow, her eyes too large. She wore a plain institutional gown, grey and shapeless. When the door opened, she flinched, pressing herself against the wall, her expression showing pure terror before recognition slowly filtered through. Professor Webb? Her voice was hoarse, as if she hadn't used it properly in weeks. Lydia, we're getting you out. Right now. Can you walk? I don't understand. How are you? No time to explain. We have perhaps 3 minutes before they realize the alarm is false and start searching. Can you walk? She nodded, standing unsteadily. Harrison moved to her, supporting her weight as they moved toward the door. Marcus was already in the corridor, checking both directions. Clear. Move. They half walked, half carried Lydia toward the service stairs. Behind them, Harrison heard shouting, someone yelling that there was no fire, that it was a false alarm, that everyone should return to their stations. They reached the stairs and started down. Second floor. Keep moving. First floor. The service entrance was ahead, the door they'd come through still unlocked. Almost there. Almost. A guard appeared at the end of the corridor, confused at first, then alarmed. Hey, what are you doing with that patient? Marcus didn't hesitate. He charged the guard, hitting him hard in the midsection, driving him back against the wall. The guard struggled, reaching for a whistle on his belt. Marcus hit him again, a vicious punch that dropped the man to the floor, unconscious or stunned. Go, Marcus shouted. I'll hold them here. Get her out. Harrison ran, supporting Lydia, bursting through the service entrance into the evening air. Behind them, whistles were blowing, voices shouting, the facility waking to the realization that someone had breached their security. He ran for the wall, pulling Lydia with him. She was gasping, her legs weak, but she kept moving, kept pushing herself. At the wall, Harrison interlaced his fingers. Step here. I'll boost you over. She put her foot in his hands. He lifted, straining, getting her high enough to grab the top of the wall. She pulled herself up with strength that seemed impossible given her condition, driven by pure, desperate will. Then she was over, dropping down the other side. Harrison grabbed the wall's top edge, pulled himself up, his arms screaming. For a terrifying moment, he thought he couldn't do it, that he'd hang there until the guards caught up. Then, adrenaline gave him the strength he needed. He pulled himself over, dropped heavily on the other side, his ankle twisting painfully as he landed. Lydia grabbed his arm. Come on. They ran into the trees, branches whipping at their faces, roots catching their feet. Behind them, Harrison heard guards at the wall, heard them climbing over. But the darkness and the dense forest gave them cover. They had perhaps a 2-minute lead. They ran for the road for where Clara waited with the wagon. 200 yards. 150. There, the road emerging from the trees, and there, the wagon, and there, Clara jumping down, her face transforming when she saw her daughter. "Mama!" Lydia's voice broke. She stumbled forward, falling into her mother's arms, both of them sobbing. "In the wagon," Harrison gasped. "Now, they're right behind us." Clara lifted Lydia into the wagon bed, climbed up after her. Harrison pulled himself onto the driver's bench, grabbed the reins, snapped them hard. The horse started forward, slow at first, then faster, pulling them away from Brightwater, away from the sounds of pursuit, away from the facility where they'd tried to break a brilliant child's mind. They drove through the night, changing roads frequently, heading generally northeast toward Connecticut. Every sound made Harrison jump, every distant rider made him think they were caught. But as hours passed and no pursuit materialized, he began to believe they might actually escape. At dawn, they reached the Safe House, a Quaker farm in northern Connecticut whose owners asked no questions. Clara and Lydia were given a room. Harrison collapsed in a chair, exhausted beyond anything he'd ever felt. But they'd done it. Against the machinery of law and institutional authority, against the power of men like Thorne, who controlled resources and respectability, they'd done it. They'd rescued one brilliant girl from captivity. Later that morning, as Clara tended to her daughter and Harrison tried to process everything that had happened, Lydia asked to speak with him privately. They sat in the farm's kitchen while Clara bathed upstairs, and Lydia looked at him with eyes that had aged years in the weeks since her abduction. "Professor Webb, I need to tell you what Dr. Thorne was planning, what he called the definitive test. You don't have to talk about that now. You're safe. You can rest. No, you need to know. You need to understand what you saved me from." She took a shaking breath. "He was going to perform surgery on my brain." Harrison felt the room tilt. "What?" He said it was the only way to definitively understand the source of my abilities. He said the measurements and tests were inconclusive, that the only way to prove whether my intelligence was genuine or aberrant was to examine my brain directly. He described the procedure in detail, how he would open my skull, remove sections of brain tissue for analysis, map the structures that might explain my abilities. He said I would likely die during or shortly after the surgery, but that was acceptable for the advancement of science. He said my sacrifice would help determine the truth about racial intelligence once and for all. She was crying now, silently, tears streaming down her face. He talked about it like he was being kind to me, like he was doing me a favor by making my death meaningful. He kept saying that surely I understood the importance of contributing to scientific knowledge, that this was my chance to matter, to be part of something larger than myself. And I realized that he genuinely believed it. He thought he was being reasonable, that killing me to study my brain was a legitimate scientific methodology. Because to him, I'm not a person. I'm a specimen, and specimens exist to be studied, no matter what it costs them. Harrison pulled her into an embrace, feeling her thin frame shaking against him. "He will never touch you again, I promise. We're taking you somewhere he can't reach you. You'll be free to learn and grow and become whatever you're capable of becoming. And he'll spend the rest of his life knowing that the evidence that proved him wrong escaped. Do you think he'll stop looking for me? I think he'll try to find you. But, Professor, the world is large, and we're going to make you disappear into it so thoroughly that Dr. Marcus Thorne will search for the rest of his life and never find you. You'll become a ghost story, the brilliant girl who vanished, the one who got away, and that will haunt him forever." For the first time since her rescue, Lydia smiled, a small, fierce expression that suggested that despite everything they'd done to her, despite all the weeks of isolation and examination and fear, They hadn't broken what mattered most. Her mind was still hers. Her brilliance still burned. And now she would have the chance to see what she could become when given freedom instead of captivity, education instead of examination, humanity instead of being treated as a specimen. But the question that haunted all of them as they prepared for the final journey to Canada was whether escape was enough. Whether one girl's freedom meant anything if the system that had tried to destroy her remained intact, ready to do the same to the next brilliant child who threatened the comfortable lies that kept the racial hierarchy in place. And it's here, at this moment of successful escape but uncertain future, that we must pause again. They crossed into Canada on July 2nd, 1897, using forged documents that identified them as the Miller family. John Miller, a widowed schoolteacher from Vermont, his sister Clara Miller, and her daughter Sarah Miller, traveling to Toronto to take up a teaching position. The border guards barely glanced at them, 3 more Americans among thousands crossing for work or opportunity, or reasons they didn't care to explain. And just like that, Professor Harrison Webb ceased to exist. John Miller, with his small savings and his guilty conscience and his determination to see through what he'd started, took his place. Toronto in 1897 was a city transformed by migration. Thousands of freed slaves and their descendants had made their way north over the decades, creating communities that understood the necessity of protecting those who fled American injustice. The Millers, as they now called themselves, found rooms in one of these communities, a boarding house run by a woman named Margaret Hawthorne, whose own parents had escaped slavery via the Underground Railroad 50 years earlier. Margaret asked no questions about their past, required no explanations for the careful way they avoided giving details about where they'd come from or why they'd left. She'd seen enough refugees to recognize the signs, people who startled at unexpected knocks, who read newspapers with anxious attention to articles about fugitives and extradition, who kept bags packed near the door in case they needed to run again. She gave them space, offered quiet support, and connected them with others who might help. The first months were about survival and adjustment. Harrison, now John, found work tutoring the children of wealthy Toronto families, using his genuine mathematical expertise while carefully avoiding any mention of MIT or his academic credentials. The pay was modest but adequate. Clara found work as a seamstress, her cleaning days behind her, finally doing labor that didn't leave her exhausted and aching. And Lydia, now Sarah, slowly began to recover from the trauma of Brightwater. The physical recovery came first. Regular meals, rest, freedom from the constant stress of examination and confinement. She gained weight, her face filling out, color returning to her skin. But the psychological recovery took longer. She had nightmares that left her screaming, waking the entire boarding house. She couldn't tolerate locked doors, would panic if left alone in a closed room. She startled at footsteps in hallways, convinced that guards were coming, and she couldn't do mathematics. This was perhaps the most troubling symptom. When Harrison tried to continue her education, presenting her with problems that she would once have solved instantly, she would stare at the paper with rising panic, her breath quickening, her hands shaking. The mathematics that had once been her refuge, the one thing that made sense in a chaotic world, had been poisoned by association with Thorne's examinations. Every equation reminded her of the testing room at Brightwater. Every calculation brought back memories of being asked to perform, to prove her abilities, to demonstrate her value as a specimen. "I can't see it anymore," she told Harrison one evening, 3 months after their escape, tears of frustration streaming down her face. "The shapes, the patterns, the way numbers used to fit together in my head, it's like there's fog over everything. I look at a problem and I just see symbols on paper, not the architecture underneath. He broke something in me, Professor. Doctor. Thorne broke the part of my mind that could do the thing that made me special." "You're still special, Lydia. Your mind is still remarkable. You're just traumatized. That's normal after what you experienced. But what if it doesn't come back? What if I lost it permanently?" Then what was the point? We ran, you gave up everything, Mama lost her home, and for what? To save a girl who isn't even particularly smart anymore? Harrison grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. Listen to me carefully. Your value as a human being has nothing to do with your mathematical abilities. Nothing. You are worthwhile because you exist, because you're a person with thoughts and feelings and dignity, not because you can solve equations faster than other people. Even if you never do advanced mathematics again for the rest of your life still matters. You still matter. Do you understand? She wanted to believe him. But she'd spent her entire life being told that her only value was in her exceptional abilities, that the only reason people like Professor Webb paid attention to her was because she could do things other people couldn't. Take away the mathematics and what was left? Just another colored girl in a world that had no use for colored girls. The breakthrough came in October, 4 months after their escape. Lydia was walking through Toronto's Market District with her mother when she stopped suddenly, staring at a construction site where workers were building a new commercial building. Clara, accustomed to her daughter's strange focuses, waited patiently. "Mama," Lydia said slowly, "that beam they're placing, it's going to fail. The angle is wrong for the load distribution. I can see it." "How can you see that, baby?" "Because..." Lydia paused, her hand moving through the air as if tracing invisible lines. "Because I can see the forces again. The mathematics, it's coming back." "Oh God, Mama, it's coming back." She started crying, but this time with relief and joy. The fog in her mind was lifting. The shapes and patterns she'd thought were lost forever were revealing themselves again, still there, just buried under trauma, waiting for safety and time to uncover them. The recovery wasn't instant or complete. There were still bad days when the mathematics eluded her, when memory of Brightwater overwhelmed everything else. But gradually, steadily, Lydia's abilities returned. Harrison resumed her education, carefully, gently, always letting her control the pace, never pushing when she showed signs of distress. And something remarkable happened. As Lydia healed, her abilities didn't just return to their previous level, they grew. The time away from mathematics, the experience of losing and regaining her gift, had given her a different perspective. She approached problems with new creativity, finding solutions that were more elegant, more intuitive than before. It was as if her mind had been reorganizing itself during the months of fog, making new connections, developing new pathways. By her 14th birthday in April 1898, she was working on mathematical problems that Harrison himself struggled to understand, venturing into territories where he could no longer effectively teach her because she'd surpassed his expertise. "I need to find you better teachers," he told her one evening, after she'd solved a problem in non-Euclidean geometry that had taken him 3 days to even properly understand. "You're working at a level that requires university instruction, possibly graduate-level instruction." "That's impossible," Lydia said simply. "No university will admit a 14-year-old colored girl. Maybe not officially, but there might be other ways. Let me ask around. See if any professors at the University of Toronto might be willing to work with you privately." He did ask around, carefully, discreetly, testing whether the academic community in Toronto might be more open-minded than their American counterparts. The responses were mixed. Some professors dismissed the idea out of hand, unwilling to waste time on a Negro child, regardless of her supposed abilities. Others expressed interest, but wanted extensive proof before committing time to such an unusual student. And a few, a precious few, agreed to meet with Lydia simply because they were curious, because the intellectual challenge of working with an exceptional mind outweighed their prejudices or social concerns. Professor Daniel Morrison was the first to take her seriously. He was 63 years old, nearing retirement from the University of Toronto's mathematics department, with a reputation for brilliance and eccentricity in equal measure. He'd published groundbreaking work on differential equations and had little patience for academic politics or social conventions. When Harrison approached him with the carefully edited story of a young prodigy who needed advanced instruction, Morrison's response was characteristically blunt: "Bring her round. If she's as capable as you claim, I'll know within an hour. If she's not, stop wasting my time." The meeting took place in Morrison's cluttered office, books and papers stacked everywhere, blackboards covered in half-erased equations. Lydia entered nervously, still uncomfortable around authority figures after Brightwater. Morrison barely looked at her, just gestured toward a chair and said, "Sit. I'm going to give you a problem. Take as long as you need to solve it." He wrote on the blackboard a complex problem involving infinite series convergence, the kind of question that would appear on a qualifying examination for doctoral students. Then he returned to his desk and began grading papers, apparently forgetting Lydia's presence. She studied the problem for perhaps 5 minutes, her head tilting in that characteristic way, her eyes tracking invisible patterns. Then she stood, took chalk, and began writing. Morrison glanced up occasionally, watching her work, his expression unreadable. When she finished, she set down the chalk and returned to her seat without speaking. Morrison approached the board, studied her solution for several minutes, checking each step. Then he turned to look at her properly for the first time. "How old are you?" "14, sir. Who taught you this methodology?" "No one, sir. I just saw that if you restructured the series this way, the convergence became obvious." Morrison returned to the board, examining her work more closely. This is an approach I've never seen. It's valid, elegant even, but it's not in any textbook. You developed this just now?" "Yes, sir. The standard approaches seem too complicated. I thought there must be a simpler way, so I looked for it." Morrison was silent for a long moment. Then he returned to his desk, pulled out a sheet of paper, and began writing rapidly. When he finished, he handed the paper to Harrison. "These are the names of 4 other professors in this city who might be qualified to work with her in areas where I'm not expert. Physics, advanced algebra, theoretical mechanics, logic. Between us, we can provide her with education equivalent to what she'd receive in a doctoral program. But Mr. Miller, I need you to understand something. This girl is not just talented. She's genuinely exceptional. The kind of mind that appears maybe once in a generation, possibly once in several generations. She needs to be developed carefully, challenged appropriately, protected from those who would exploit her." "She's been exploited before," Harrison said carefully, uncertain how much to reveal. "We left the United States partly to escape that situation." Morrison studied him with sharp eyes. "I'm not going to pry into your past, but I will say this. Whatever her abilities, whatever her potential, she's a colored girl in a world that's hostile to colored girls. Even here, even in Canada, where things are theoretically better, she'll face barriers. She'll be dismissed, underestimated, excluded from opportunities that mediocre white men take for granted. If we're going to educate her, we need to be realistic about what her future holds. She can't publish under her own name without being ignored or mocked. She can't attend university officially. She can't pursue a conventional academic career. So the question becomes, what do we train her for? What's the end point of this education? It was the question that haunted all of them. What was the point of developing Lydia's abilities if she had no legitimate avenue to use them? They couldn't publish her work without exposing her to exactly the kind of attention they'd fled. They couldn't send her to university without risking discovery. They couldn't let her build a public reputation without making her vulnerable to people like Thorne, who would see her as a threat to be neutralized or a specimen to be studied. The solution they developed was both practical and profoundly unfair. Lydia would continue her education, working privately with Morrison and his colleagues. She would develop her abilities, pursuing mathematical research at the highest levels. But her work would be published under Harrison's name, with him serving as a front, a respectable white male face that the academic world could accept. Lydia would be a ghost, the brilliant mind behind discoveries that others would receive credit for. When Harrison proposed this arrangement, Lydia was quiet for a long time. "So I do the work, and you get the recognition. Yes, it's unjust, and I hate it. But it's the only way I can see for your work to actually reach people who might use it, build on it, advance the field. If we publish under your name, it will be ignored or dismissed. If we publish under mine, it has a chance to matter. Will anyone know? Eventually, I mean. Will history know that I'm the one who actually did the work? I'll document everything. Every paper we publish, I'll keep records showing you're the true author. Someday, when it's safe, when society has changed enough that the truth won't destroy you, we'll reveal it. But that might not happen in our lifetimes." Lydia looked at her mother, seeking guidance. Clara's expression was pained. "Baby, I can't tell you what to do. This is your genius, your life. But I can tell you that invisible survival is better than spectacular destruction. If this is what it takes for you to do the work you love without being imprisoned or dissected by men who see you as a threat, then maybe it's worth it." "Will I ever get to just be myself?" Lydia asked, the question carrying the weight of everything she'd lost. "Will I ever get to stand in front of people and say, I solved this, I discovered this, I matter?" "I don't know," Harrison admitted. "I hope so. I hope we're building toward a world where that becomes possible. But I can't promise it." Lydia was 14 years old, already traumatized by captivity, already aware that her brilliance was both gift and curse. She made the choice that countless other brilliant people suppressed by systems of oppression have made throughout history. She chose invisible contribution over visible destruction. "All right, we'll do it your way. But Professor Webb, promise me something. Promise that you'll document everything. Promise that someday, somehow, the truth will come out. I don't need statues or fame. I just need someone someday to know I existed, that I wasn't just a ghost, that I mattered. I promise." And so began one of the strangest collaborations in mathematical history. Over the next 15 years, from 1898 to 1913, Harrison Webb published 17 papers in various mathematical and engineering journals, work that earned him a reputation as a brilliant and unconventional thinker. The papers covered topics ranging from advanced topology to fluid dynamics to theoretical mechanics, each one pushing the boundaries of existing knowledge, each one written in a distinctive style that emphasized visual and intuitive approaches to complex problems. What the mathematical community didn't know was that every one of those papers had been written by Lydia Johnson, working in a small apartment in Toronto, filling notebooks with ideas and proofs that Harrison would then transcribe and submit under his name. She would develop the core concepts, work through the mathematics, explain her reasoning to Harrison. He would write it up in formal academic language, add references and citations, navigate the publication process. They were a team, but an invisible one, with only one of them visible to the world. The mathematics itself was extraordinary. Lydia's 1902 paper on novel approaches to calculating stress distribution in complex structural systems would become foundational to modern structural engineering, though it would be credited to Harrison Webb. Her 1907 work on intuitive visualization methods for multi-dimensional mathematical spaces would influence the development of topology for decades, again under Harrison's name. Her 1911 paper on predictive modeling of fluid turbulence contained insights that wouldn't be fully appreciated until the development of chaos theory 50 years later, but history would remember it as Harrison Webb's work. She was brilliant, productive, contributing meaningfully to human knowledge, and she was erased, her name absent from the historical record, her achievements attributed to someone else. It was survival, but it was also a kind of slow death, the gradual disappearance of identity in exchange for the ability to keep doing the work she loved. If you've stayed with me this far through Lydia's story, through her discovery and exploitation and escape and eventual anonymous contribution, I want to ask you something. How many other brilliant minds have been lost to history because systems of oppression made it impossible for them to be acknowledged? How many discoveries are credited to the wrong people because the real geniuses were the wrong color, wrong gender, wrong class? Subscribe to the Sealed Room because we're committed to uncovering these buried stories, to refusing to let brilliance be forgotten just because it appeared in people that society decided didn't matter. Tell me in the comments what you think about Lydia's choice to work anonymously. Was it the right decision? What would you have done? Your engagement helps us continue this work of historical recovery. But Lydia's story doesn't end with anonymous publication. Because in 1913, something happened that would force all of them to confront the question of whether silent survival was enough. Dr. Marcus Thorne published a book. It was titled The Question of Negro Intelligence, a Scientific Assessment, and it was designed to be the definitive statement on racial hierarchy, a comprehensive argument that Negro intellectual inferiority was biological, immutable, and scientifically proven. The book was 500 pages of craniometric data, intelligence test results, comparative studies, all building toward the conclusion that white supremacy wasn't a social preference, but a natural law supported by objective evidence. And buried in Chapter 7, there was a case study that made Harrison's blood run cold when he read it. The case of E.D., a cautionary tale of anomalous presentation. Thorne didn't use Lydia's name, but he described her case in detail. The 13-year-old Negro girl who had demonstrated apparently remarkable mathematical abilities. The examination at MIT. The subsequent detailed study that revealed the truth about her condition. According to Thorne's account, follow-up examination had shown that the girl's abilities were not genuine intelligence, but rather a form of savant syndrome, a narrow calculation skill divorced from real comprehension. He claimed that under controlled conditions, she had failed to demonstrate the abilities initially reported. He suggested that the original claims about her capacities had been exaggerated by abolitionist sympathizers seeking to manufacture evidence of Negro equality. He concluded the case study by noting that the subject had ultimately been institutionalized for mental instability, a tragic but inevitable outcome for individuals whose brains developed abnormally, producing isolated abilities at the cost of general dysfunction. It was a comprehensive lie, a rewriting of history designed to neutralize the threat that Lydia's existence posed to Thorne's theories. And because Lydia had disappeared, because she couldn't speak publicly to refute these claims, Thorne's version would become the official record. Future scientists reading his book would learn about the Negro girl who seemed brilliant but was actually damaged, who proved not that racial theories were wrong but that apparent exceptions could be explained away through careful analysis. Harrison showed the book to Lydia. She read the chapter in silence, her face unreadable. When she finished, she set the book down carefully. "He's erasing me, not just my name, but my existence as anything other than a cautionary tale. He's taking everything I am and turning it into evidence for what he wanted to prove all along. We can refute this. We can publish a response, explain what really happened." Under whose name? Yours. Then Thorne will ask how you know so much about this girl's case unless you were directly involved, which would lead to questions about where she is now, which would expose us. We can't fight this without destroying ourselves, so we let him lie. We keep doing what we've been doing. We keep contributing, keep advancing mathematics, keep proving through our work that the mind behind it is brilliant. Maybe that's enough. Maybe the work matters more than the recognition. But the bitterness in her voice suggested she didn't entirely believe that. The truth was that Thorne's book hurt in ways that isolation and examination hadn't, because it was existential erasure, the claim that she had never been what she was, that her brilliance had been imaginary or fraudulent, that she was a cautionary tale rather than a revolutionary example. How do you fight that? How do you prove you exist when the system is designed to deny your existence? Over the following years, Harrison and Lydia continued their collaboration, continued producing papers, continued advancing mathematical knowledge, but something had changed. Lydia became more withdrawn, more isolated. She rarely left the apartment. She poured herself into mathematics with an intensity that bordered on obsession, as if trying to prove something to herself, if not to the world. Clara watched her daughter with growing concern. "She's disappearing," Clara told Harrison in 1916, 20 years after they'd fled to Canada. "Not physically, but in every other way. She's becoming nothing but the mathematics, like she's decided that if she can't be a person in the world, she'll just be a mind doing calculations. That's not living. What do you suggest? We've tried everything we can think of to give her a normal life while protecting her from exposure. I don't know, but I know this can't continue. My daughter is 29 years old. She's never had a romantic relationship because she's terrified anyone she gets close to will discover who she really is. She has no friends because friendship requires sharing yourself, and she can't share herself without risking everything. She's a ghost, and I'm starting to think that maybe dying as herself would have been better than surviving as nobody." It was a brutal assessment, and Harrison couldn't argue against it. In saving Lydia's life, had they condemned her to a different kind of death? The slow erasure of identity, the gradual disappearance of self. The question haunted him, and it was still haunting him on March 17th, 1918, when Lydia Johnson died of influenza during the great pandemic that swept across the world that year. She was 56 years old, worn out from decades of labor and worry, her last years spent watching her brilliant daughter fade into anonymity. Lydia, who remembered everything perfectly, would never forget her mother's final words. "Baby, promise me something. Promise me you'll find a way to be yourself. Even if it's dangerous, even if it means losing the work, you can't spend your whole life being someone else's ghost. Promise me." "I promise, Mama," but it was a promise Lydia didn't know how to keep. After Clara's death, something broke in Lydia. Or perhaps something that had been holding together through sheer will finally came apart. She stopped working on mathematics. She stopped responding to Harrison's attempts to engage her. She spent days sitting silently, staring at nothing, trapped in memories that her perfect recall wouldn't let fade. The trauma of Brightwater, the years of hiding, the erosion of identity, her mother's death, all of it accumulating into a weight that no amount of mathematical brilliance could solve. Harrison, now 58 years old and not in the best health himself, tried everything. He brought her books, proposed new problems, arranged meetings with Morrison and the other professors who'd worked with her over the years. Nothing penetrated the depression that had settled over her like fog. "Maybe," she told him during one of the few conversations she would still engage in, "maybe Dr. Thorne was right after all. Not about Negro inferiority, but about me specifically. Maybe I am an anomaly, a malfunction. Maybe my mind works wrong, producing abilities that don't fit anywhere, that can't be used for anything except causing trouble. Maybe it would have been better if I'd never been discovered at all. If I'd just stayed a cleaning woman's daughter, illiterate and invisible, living a small life that didn't threaten anyone. You can't believe that. You've contributed more to mathematics than most people who have full careers and public recognition. I've contributed anonymously under a false name while hiding from the world. What's the point? What does any of it matter if I don't exist?" Harrison had no answer. And he was running out of time to find one. His own health was declining, his heart condition worsening. The doctor had told him he probably had 2 years at most. What would happen to Lydia when he died? Who would protect her? Who would document her work? Who would remember that she was real? In the summer of 1919, Harrison made a decision. He wrote a detailed account of everything that had happened, from discovering Lydia in 1897 to the present day. He documented her abilities, the examination, the abduction, the rescue, the years of anonymous collaboration. He collected all of Lydia's original manuscripts, her notebooks full of mathematical derivations and ideas, proof that she was the true author of the work published under his name. And he sealed it all in a metal box with instructions that it should be opened in 1969, 50 years in the future, when presumably the racial climate would have changed enough that Lydia's story could be told without endangering anyone. He showed the box to Lydia. "This is your legacy. Everything you've done, everything you've been. Someday, people will know the truth." She looked at the box with hollow eyes. 50 years? I'll probably be dead by then. So I get to spend my entire life being nobody, and then become somebody after I'm gone. That's supposed to comfort me? It's the best I can do. I'm sorry it's not enough. It's never been enough. But I suppose it's more than most people like me get, so I should be grateful. There was no bitterness in her voice, which somehow made it worse. Just flat acceptance of injustice, resignation to erasure. In October 1919, Harrison Webb died of heart failure at age 59. His obituary in Toronto papers mentioned his work as a tutor and his occasional mathematical publications, noting that he'd made modest contributions to the field. It didn't mention that he'd been a professor at MIT, or that he'd sacrificed his career to rescue a brilliant child, or that the mathematical work he'd published was actually written by someone else. History recorded him as a minor figure, a footnote at best. After Harrison's death, Lydia disappeared. The few people who'd known her as Sarah Miller reported that she'd moved away, destination unknown. Morrison and the other professors who'd worked with her tried to find her, concerned about her welfare, but she'd vanished completely. Some thought she'd moved to another city, or perhaps died shortly after losing the one person who'd anchored her to the world. The metal box Harrison had sealed was placed in a safety deposit vault at a Toronto bank to be opened in 1969 as specified in his will. But in 1925, the bank underwent reorganization. Records were lost or misfiled. The box was eventually transferred to a storage facility, its original instructions no longer attached. It sat there for decades, forgotten, gathering dust alongside thousands of other unclaimed items. In 1969, when it should have been opened, nobody knew it existed. The truth it contained remained buried. And Lydia Johnson? What became of her after Harrison's death? For 90 years, historians who noticed the occasional reference to her case assumed she died young, another casualty of the brutal racial conditions of the early 20th century. But in 2009, a graduate student in Toronto, researching the history of the city's black communities, found something unexpected. A death certificate from 1963 for a woman named Sarah Miller, age 79, occupation listed as seamstress. No surviving family. No notable achievements recorded. Just another elderly black woman dying quietly, unremarked, unmemoried. The graduate student almost moved on, but something about the date of birth caught her attention. April 1884. That would make her 13 in 1897, the right age to match scattered references she'd seen about a Negro mathematical prodigy in Boston who'd vanished. She dug deeper, finding a few more records. Sarah Miller had worked various jobs over the decades: seamstress, cleaning woman, occasionally as a tutor for children in her community. She'd lived alone in a small apartment in Toronto's Ward neighborhood. She'd had no children, never married, lived quietly for 44 years after Harrison Webb's death. And then the graduate student found something extraordinary. Among Sarah Miller's possessions, auctioned off after her death to pay outstanding debts, was a trunk full of notebooks. Mathematical notebooks, hundreds of pages of calculations and proofs and theoretical work, all dated from 1920 to 1963, all written in a clear, precise hand. All containing mathematics that, when the graduate student showed them to her advisor, proved to be far ahead of their time. One notebook, dated 1947, contained work on information theory that paralleled and in some ways exceeded Claude Shannon's groundbreaking research published the following year. Another, from 1952, explored concepts in computational theory that wouldn't be formalized until the development of computer science decades later. A third, from 1959, worked through problems in quantum mechanics that were still being debated. Sarah Miller, elderly black seamstress, had been producing cutting-edge mathematical research in complete isolation for over 40 years. Research that no one would see, that no one would know about, that contributed nothing to the advancement of mathematics because it was trapped in notebooks in a trunk in an apartment where nobody thought to look for genius. The graduate student spent 3 years tracking down Sarah Miller's real identity, following fragmentary references, connecting dots across a century of deliberately obscured history. She found Thorne's book with its case study of E.D. She found scattered references to a Negro prodigy in Boston in 1897. She found Harrison Webb's publications and noticed the distinctive visual intuitive style that didn't match his earlier work before 1898. And eventually, she found the metal box, forgotten in a storage facility, containing Harrison Webb's full account of Lydia Johnson's life. In 2012, the graduate student, now doctor, Jennifer Morrison, published a book titled The Ghost Mathematician, The True Story of Lydia Johnson. It documented everything: the childhood discovery, the examination, the abduction, the rescue, the decades of anonymous collaboration, the final 40 years of complete isolation. It reproduced Lydia's mathematical work, analyzed her contributions, argued for her recognition as one of the most important mathematical minds of her era. The book won academic awards. It sparked discussions about hidden figures in mathematical history, about how many other brilliant minds had been suppressed or erased by systems of oppression. Universities held symposiums about Lydia Johnson. There was talk of renaming buildings, establishing scholarships in her memory, finally giving her the recognition she'd been denied in life. But there was also backlash. Some historians questioned whether Lydia Johnson had been as brilliant as claimed, suggesting the evidence might be exaggerated or misinterpreted. Some mathematicians argued that her work, while competent, wasn't revolutionary enough to warrant the attention it was receiving. And some simply dismissed the entire story as politically motivated revisionist history, an attempt to manufacture black achievement where none existed. The arguments that Lydia Johnson had spent her life trying to escape, the debates about whether her brilliance was real or imaginary, whether she deserved recognition or should remain a footnote, continued long after her death, exactly as she'd feared they would. Because here's the terrible truth about Lydia Johnson's story. She was real. Her abilities were genuine. Her contributions were significant, and none of it mattered because the system wasn't designed to acknowledge people like her. She could have been twice as brilliant, and it wouldn't have been enough. She could have solved every unsolved problem in mathematics, and it wouldn't have changed the fundamental fact that she was a black woman in a world that had decided black women couldn't be geniuses. So, what do we do with Lydia Johnson's story? How do we make sense of a life that produced so much brilliance and received so little recognition? How do we honor someone who spent their entire existence being erased? Maybe we start by asking different questions, not, was she as brilliant as claimed, but how many others like her never had anyone to document their existence at all? Not, did she contribute enough to deserve remembering, but what kind of world forces genius to justify its own existence? Not, should we rename a building after her? But how do we dismantle the systems that made her invisible in the first place? Because Lydia Johnson wasn't an anomaly, she was a pattern. A pattern repeated thousands of times across history, brilliant minds suppressed because they appeared in bodies that society had decided didn't matter. Black mathematicians, women, scientists, indigenous astronomers, working-class inventors, disabled scholars, queer artists, all the people who had to hide their brilliance or see it stolen or watch it be dismissed because they didn't fit the narrow definition of who was allowed to be called genius. Some of them, like Lydia, left fragments of evidence behind, enough for us to reconstruct their stories, to finally acknowledge their existence. But most of them are just gone, their names forgotten, their work unrecorded, their brilliance vanished as if it never existed, and that's the real tragedy. Not just what happened to Lydia Johnson, but what happened to all the others we'll never know about. So here's what I want you to take from Lydia's story. When you hear about someone being brilliant, being revolutionary, being exceptional, ask yourself, who's not in that conversation? Who should be there but isn't? Who got erased so that someone else could take credit? Whose genius are we still ignoring because acknowledging it would require us to admit uncomfortable truths about how our society works? Lydia Johnson died in 1963, 83 years after her mother watched her calculate impossible equations in her head and hoped it would lead to something better. She died alone, unremarked, having spent most of her life being nobody. Her brilliance survived in notebooks that sat forgotten for 50 years. Her story survived because one professor cared enough to document it and one graduate student cared enough to find it. But how many others didn't survive? How many brilliant children were broken before anyone noticed they were brilliant? How many extraordinary minds were convinced they were nothing special because everyone around them said so? How many revolutionaries died as ghosts? We'll never know. That's the horror of systematic erasure. It doesn't just destroy people, it destroys the evidence that they existed in the first place. Lydia Johnson existed. She was brilliant. She mattered. And the fact that we almost forgot her should terrify us into asking who we're forgetting right now. What do you think? Could Lydia have done anything differently? Should Harrison Webb have published the truth despite the dangers? Was anonymous contribution better than no contribution at all? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. This is the work we do here, recovering the voices that were silenced, the stories that were buried, the truths that powerful people wanted forgotten. And if you believe this work matters, if you think these stories need to be told, then subscribe, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and help us make sure that the Lydia Johnsons of history are finally seen. Thank you for staying with me through this long, difficult story. Thank you for caring about a brilliant girl who deserved so much better than what the world gave her. And remember, history isn't just what we're told, it's what we dig up, it's what we refuse to let die. Until next time.